March 12, 1945. The sky over the Rhineland is a bruised purple, heavy with the scent of wet ash and the metallic tang of spent artillery shells. In the distance, the low rumble of the American Third Army's mechanized divisions vibrates through the frozen mud of a crumbling fatherland. For Maria, a 22-year-old signals auxiliary, the world has narrowed to the frigid interior of a damp cellar. The air is thick with the dust of fallen plaster and the shallow, terrified breaths of her companions, nurses, clerks, and communications personnel of the Wehrmacht. They have been told for years that the Americans are a soulless, mechanized horde, a cultureless mass that would show no mercy to the women of Germany. As the heavy boots of infantrymen kick open the cellar door and the blinding beam of a flashlight cuts through the dark, Maria expects the end. She expects the cold finality of a bullet or the harshness of a labor camp. She does not yet know that her journey is not toward a grave, but toward a realization that would shatter every pillar of the ideology she was raised to serve. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was a hollow shell, a nightmare of its own making. As the Allied pincer closed from the east and west, thousands of German women who had been drafted into the Wehrmachtelferinnen, the female auxiliary corps, found themselves on the front lines of a collapsing empire. These were not the front-line combatants of the Eastern Front, but they were the backbone of the German military machine. The radio operators, the anti-aircraft assistants, and the medical staff. Their capture presented the United States military with a unique logistical and moral challenge. While the Geneva Convention dictated the treatment of prisoners of war, the sheer scale of the German collapse meant that hundreds of thousands of individuals were now entering a system of captivity that was never designed for such numbers. For these women, indoctrinated by a decade of Joseph Goebbels' propaganda, the prospect of being captured by the Amos was a fate draped in horror. They had been told the Americans were decadent, weak, and yet paradoxically brutal. They expected the same starvation and exposure that their own government had inflicted upon millions in the East. They braced themselves for the cold. The journey began in the back of open-air trucks, winding through the skeletal remains of German cities like Cologne and Frankfurt. To Maria and her fellow captives, the sight of the American supply lines was the first crack in their worldview. Miles upon miles of trucks, jeeps, and tanks, all seemingly brand new, all fueled by an endless reservoir of gasoline. This was the industrial might of a democracy they had been told was fractured and inefficient. But the physical shock of the journey was nothing compared to the sensory overload of the transport ships. As they were led into the holds of the great Atlantic liners, repurposed for troop transport, the women were met not with chains, but with the scent of soap and hot coffee. They were being taken across the ocean, far from the reach of the vengeance of the Red Army, to a place that existed in their minds only as a myth of skyscrapers and gangsters. Upon their arrival at the docks of New York and the subsequent train journey to the interior of the United States, the German women sat in stunned silence. They looked out the windows of Pullman coaches at a land that had never known the scream of a Stuka or the thud of a 1,000-pound bomb. The lights of American towns, glowing defiantly in the night without the need for blackouts, seemed like a provocation from another planet. They passed through the vast rolling plains of the Midwest and the pine forests of the South, heading toward camps like Camp Clinton in Mississippi and Camp Ruston in Louisiana. These were places built to house the nearly 425,000 German prisoners of war who would eventually call America their temporary home. For the women, the fear remained, a lingering, sharp anxiety that this was all a facade, a cruel trick before the inevitable hardship began. The moment of transformation occurred at the threshold of the barracks. As Maria was led into her quarters at the POW camp, she stopped in her tracks. The room was clean, the floors swept, and the air held the faint, sweet smell of pine cleaner. But it was the bed that drew her gaze. It was a simple military cot, but it was topped with something she had not seen in years of total war. Resting at the foot of the bed was a heavy, olive-drab wool blanket. It was thick, meticulously folded, and radiated a sense of utilitarian dignity. In the ruined barracks of the Siegfried Line, they had slept on damp straw or directly on the concrete, huddling under thin, threadbare coats that smelled of mildew and defeat. Here, in the heart of the enemy nation, was a warm bed. This wool blanket would become the recurring symbol of their captivity, a tactile refutation of everything they had been taught to believe about the American character. To the German prisoner, a blanket was not merely a piece of bedding, it was life. On the Eastern Front, a stolen blanket was the difference between waking up or freezing into the earth. In the American camps, the blanket was a standard issue, a given, an afterthought of an economy so vast it could afford to clothe its enemies in warmth. When Maria first sat on that bed and ran her fingers over the coarse, sturdy fibers of the wool, she felt a wave of confusion that was almost painful. Why would a nation that had every reason to hate them provide them with such comfort? Why was the bed warm? The historical records of the Provost Marshal General's office reveal that the treatment of German POWs in the United States was governed by a strict adherence to the Geneva Convention, driven partly by a desire to ensure American prisoners in Germany were treated well, but also by a fundamental belief in the superiority of the democratic way of life. The rations provided to the prisoners were, in many cases, superior to those available to the German civilian population and even to some Allied soldiers. The women were given access to hot showers, feminine hygiene products, and laundry facilities. The data shows that the average German POW gained between 20 and 30 pounds during their first 6 months in American captivity. For women who had survived on ersatz coffee and sawdust-filled bread, the arrival of a meal tray was a psychological event. The food was a weapon of a different sort, a weapon of abundance. The women were served white bread, a substance so soft and pale it looked like cake to their eyes. They were given real butter, canned peaches in thick syrup, and meat that was not a mystery of gristle and bone. The sound of the mess hall, the clink of metal trays and the hum of conversation, replaced the sound of sirens and distant explosions. But always they returned to the barracks, to the sanctuary of the warm bed and the wool blanket. It was there, in the quiet hours of the Mississippi night, that the indoctrination began to fail. The decadent Americans had provided a level of care that the master race had failed to provide its own people in their hour of greatest need. The emotional contrast was staggering. In Germany, the concept of the Volksgemeinschaft, the national community, had been built on sacrifice, struggle, and the hardening of the spirit against weakness. To be warm was a luxury. To be comfortable was almost a sin against the war effort. Yet, here were the Americans, seemingly unburdened by the grim asceticism of the Nazi state. The guards, often young men from Iowa or Nebraska, treated the women not with the predatory aggression they had been warned of, but with a mixture of professional distance and occasional, baffling kindness. A guard might share a Hershey bar or a pack of Lucky Strikes, not as a bribe, but as a casual gesture of surplus. This surplus, the sheer more-than-enoughness of America, was more subversive than any propaganda leaflet dropped by AB 17. The transformation of perception was not immediate. It was a slow erosion, like water wearing away stone. For Maria and her companions, the first weeks were spent in a state of hypervigilance, waiting for the catch. They looked for hidden cameras, for poison in the food, for the sudden arrival of the secret police. But the only thing that arrived was the program of intellectual diversion. This was the official U.S. effort at re-education. The prisoners were shown films of the liberation of the concentration camps, Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. For many of the women, the initial reaction was denial. They claimed the footage was a Hollywood fabrication, a lie designed to shame them. However, the reality of their daily life made the denial harder to maintain. How could a nation that treated its prisoners with such meticulous legalistic care be the same evil entity their leaders described? And conversely, how could their own leaders, who had promised them glory, have presided over the horrors shown on the screen. The wool blanket, always there, always warm, served as a silent witness to the truth of American resources and American values. It represented a society that could prioritize the human dignity of a captured enemy because its own dignity was not under threat by scarcity. The blanket was democracy made tangible. It was heavy, it was plain, and it was warm. As 1945 turned to 1946, the German women in the American camps began to undergo a profound ideological shift. They started to organize their own camp life, forming choirs, theater groups, and study circles. They were allowed to publish their own newspapers, provided they avoided Nazi rhetoric. The censorship was light compared to what they had known. They were allowed to write home, though the news from Germany was a litany of starvation and ruin. The letters they sent back were often filled with descriptions of the food and the beds, accounts that their starving families in the ruins of Berlin or Munich could scarcely believe. "We have sheets," one girl wrote. "We have a blanket that keeps out the night. Do not worry for me. I am in a place where the war has forgotten to be cruel." This period of golden captivity, as some historians have called it, served a strategic purpose beyond mere humanitarianism. The U.S. government realized that these prisoners would eventually return to a partitioned and broken Germany. They wanted these men and women to return as ambassadors of the American system. The warm beds and the white bread were the first lessons in a new kind of curriculum. The transformation was evident in the way the women began to interact with their environment. They stopped snapping to attention with the rigid, frightened precision of the early days. They began to walk with a different posture. They had been humanized by the very people they were told would animalize them. The symbolism of the wool blanket extended even to the way it was manufactured. Many of these blankets were produced in the textile mills of New England or the Carolinas, woven by American women who had husbands and sons fighting on the very fronts where these German auxiliaries had been captured. This cycle of production and care was a testament to the logistical miracle of the arsenal of democracy. While the German economy had cannibalized itself, turning even church bells into shell casings, the American economy had expanded to such a degree that it could provide for the entire world, friend and foe alike. The blanket was a product of a system that didn't have to choose between guns and butter. It had produced enough of both to smother the fires of fascism. By the time the repatriation process began in late 1946 and 1947, many of the German women found themselves paradoxically saddened to leave. They were going back to a Germany that was a landscape of rubble and ghosts, a place where they would once again have to fight for every scrap of coal and every crust of bread. As they packed their meager belongings, many looked back at the barracks one last time. They looked at the neatly made beds, the olive-drab blankets pulled tight and square. For some, the transition back to a life of scarcity would be the hardest battle of all. They had been spoiled by democracy, and in that spoiling, the seeds of a new Germany were sown. The legacy of the German POW experience in America is one of the most remarkable chapters of the post-war era. Of the hundreds of thousands of prisoners who returned, a vast majority carried with them a revised view of the West. They became the foundational citizens of the West German Federal Republic, a generation that understood that the strength of a nation was not measured by the reach of its borders or the volume of its propaganda, but by the way it treated the most vulnerable in its care. The women, in particular, who went on to rebuild German society as mothers, workers, and leaders, never forgot the shock of that first night in captivity. The wool blanket remains the enduring image of that time, a simple object that carried the weight of a civilization's promise. It was not a weapon of iron, but a weapon of comfort. It did not break bones. It broke a hollow ideology. It taught a generation of enemies that the greatest power a nation can wield is the power to be decent when it has every reason to be vengeful. In the end, the story of the German women who couldn't believe they were given warm beds is not merely a footnote of military history. It is a testament to the enduring truth that abundance is the greatest foil to tyranny. Fear thrives in the cold, in the dark, and in the empty stomach. It withers in the face of a hot meal and a heavy blanket. The American soldiers who handed out those blankets were not just providing bedding. They were providing a glimpse of a world where human rights were not a luxury reserved for the victors, but a standard held for all. As we look back through the fog of decades, we see that the true victory of World War II was won not only on the beaches of Normandy or in the skies over Berlin, but in the quiet barracks of places like Camp Clinton. It was won in the moment a young German woman realized that her enemy cared more for her well-being than her own leaders ever had. It was won in the warmth of a wool blanket. This is the poetic irony of freedom. It is often most visible when it is extended to those who once sought to destroy it. The abundance of a free people is not just a hoard of wealth, but a reservoir of humanity that, when poured out, has the power to wash away the stains of hate and replace them with the simple, profound peace of a warm bed. The silence of the American night, once so terrifying to the prisoners, eventually became a sound of sanctuary. The hum of the southern crickets, the distant whistle of a freight train carrying even more supplies to a world in need, and the steady, rhythmic breathing of women sleeping without fear, these were the sounds of a new world being born. The war had ended for them the moment they touched the wool and felt the heat of a room that did not smell of cordite. They had been captured by a nation, yes, but they had been liberated by a standard of living that made the rhetoric of the Reich seem like the hollow echoes of a dying god. History records the dates of surrenders and the lines of treaties, but the true history of the human spirit is written in these smaller, more intimate transformations. It is written in the eyes of a woman who expected a cell and found a room. It is written in the hands that reached out for a blanket and found a future. The warm beds of the American POW camps were the first cradles of the post-war peace, proving that while armies can conquer territory, only kindness and abundance can truly conquer the heart. And so, the olive-drab wool, coarse and heavy, remains a silent monument to the fact that even in the darkest chapters of human conflict, the light of decency can still find a way to shine, provided there is a warm bed waiting on the other side of the shadow.